For those of you who have been sleep deprived enough to hallucinate, what was it like?
In college, I tried to hold down a donut delivery job while taking a full credit load. I got up at 4:30 a.m. to deliver, and often was up until midnight or even later. After a particularly busy week with almost no sleep, I hallucinated a man crossing the street right in front of me while delivering, and I slammed on my brakes to avoid hitting him. When I realized that there was no one in the crosswalk, and no one anywhere in sight, I finished my deliveries and immediately quit my job.
I mourn for those who didn't receive their donuts the next day on time.
I had a very similar experience to this. I'm currently full-time in college, and working as a barista at a local coffee shop. I have to be awake at 4:30 a.m., at the latest, if I open at work. I'm often stuck doing homework until that late anyways, so I've gone days without sleeping on many occasions. Recently, I was driving into work for one of my opening shifts, and I thought I saw a construction worker walking out into the road full reflective vest and everything. I slammed on my brakes to avoid hitting him. Then I blinked, and there was no sign of any construction worker, and nobody else on the road around me. I didn't quit my job, but I definitely took a very long nap after I went home that day.
Once on day 3 of about less than 1 hour of sleep a night, I was driving back from where I worked, about an hour and a half from home, and it was about 3 a.m. I thought I saw some dude with an unhinged jaw and black eyes running alongside my car at around 65 miles an hour. Needless to say, he wasn't real, but he kept looking at me, and when I drove by a church he disappeared. No idea why, I'm not religious.
I once spent 3 days without sleep. By the third day everything was in soft focus, colors were wrong, and I was hearing voices whispering my name. I do not recommend it.
May I ask why you didn't sleep for so long?
I was young, dumb, and determined to burn the candle at both ends. It was 3 days of working, partying, and video games. I'm too old for that nowadays. I love my bed too much.
If you were driving back and forth during that time, then you basically were driving in as much a damaged capacity as someone who'd been drinking 5 to 10 beers, depending on your weight.
Thankfully, I was relying on public transport. If I had to be somewhere that involved driving, I definitely would have just gone to bed.
They were auditory, but I heard sirens in the distance and just kind of weird sounds, not really voices or anything distinguishable.
Like a radio or talk show playing faintly in the distance. I usually get this too. As a kid I'd sometimes hear objects crashing, like if all the pots and pans had fallen to the ground, but some of these times my family heard them too, and there was nothing fallen when we went to check. Lol. I'd also get keyboards crackling, utensils ringing on plates, like people eating. Another post reminded me I am lately getting loud booms, or pops, and I know they're not real because they sound next to my ears, but I've had noise-cancelling headphones on, both times. Had me looking for open browser tabs. Lol.
Exploding head syndrome, it's a thing. I don't have it, but I do have sleep paralysis, believed to be related. Were you starting to get tired?
Sleep paralysis is the worst. I used to have a fit almost every night where it sounded like someone was in my house robbing me, like I'd hear them tinkering around whispering mostly indistinguishable things and shushing noises. I'd try to scream for help, but it just came out as a low moaning noise or whisper from what I'm told. I eventually learned to recognize when I was having them and could force myself back to sleep to let my brain do the proper brain-to-body reconnect, but it really sucked when I'd wake up to one immediately again though. Getting off of insomnia meds helped a lot for me tbh, but I still occasionally have one every few years.
I learned about sleep paralysis early on, so every time I have had it, I never panicked, except once. The last time I had it, I remember not being able to move, and I remember feeling a presence next to my head. I clearly felt like it was a malicious presence, and my body kept trying to panic and pumping adrenaline. I kept telling myself that this was just sleep paralysis and that the panic is something that normally happens with sleep paralysis. This would lift me out of the panic. The panic would then set in again a few moments later, with me just reminding myself of the same thought and calming down. This happened maybe half a dozen times before I was able to move again. Usually I just wake up unable to move, but without the panic. I would just lie there until I could feel my limbs again and then go about my day.
I had a meth problem several years ago. I think my longest stretch was 4 days. Past a certain point you just don't know which way is up. Sure, meth can make you weird, but in my experience I think the sleep deprivation is actually what makes you lose your marbles after long enough. When I made sure I slept and ate regularly, it was almost like an energy drink. But when I binged and had my junky weeks, oof. Once I thought I was hearing music playing loudly somewhere outside. I was convinced it was a soundtrack to a big music festival I had attended a few weeks before that someone had also attended, and was now playing loudly in the middle of the night. The whole music festival, multiple bands had a soundtrack? Brew, I couldn't hear it when I listened for it, but while distracted I could plainly hear it. Dead of the night and no music was playing. Another time I was sketching in my room at like 3 a.m. I had a friend over who was just chilling with me, asking questions every so often that would lead to discussions. Slowly they responded less and less until I looked at them and they were just looking at me. Asked what was wrong, looked down, looked up waiting for the answer, and they were gone. Never there. They hadn't talked to me in months after they found out I was using. So many shadow people, and those took a long time to go away after sobering up. Whispers, hearing someone talking to me, my name being called, hearing someone talking about me. Even though I was by myself, lol. Sometimes I'd be driving and cars would suddenly be coming straight at me, lights blinding and everything, only to sort of come to, and realize I'm driving on a back road and I'm the only car for miles. By no means am I saying any weird mental shit had nothing to do with the meth. But in my experience not sleeping for days had a much more horrifying effect.
Whoa, that sounds scary as hell, especially the part about the shadow people. Did you just see them out of the corner of your eye or plain as day? Tell me more.
Yes, exactly. Like someone always just outside your line of vision every time you turn your head.
Mildly annoying. Cats in the corner of my vision for the most of it.
I stayed up with a friend working on a school report for greater than 40 hours, and by the end of it we were both convinced that a cat had gotten into my house. Turned out we were just hallucinating the sounds, weird movements in our peripheral vision, and thought it must be a cat.
I totally hallucinated a vivid cat once, after being awake for over 24 hours. My partner's old roommate had taken their cat finally to their new place, but I totally saw the cat laying in his usual spot looking up at me. It's like your brain is so tired that it inserts stuff that you're used to, accustomed to seeing someplace.
While deployed overseas with lack of sleep for like 70+ hours, I would black out and re-experience, dream completely different scenarios that happened days prior. It was crazy. Like deja vu, but for like an hour. I'd snap out of it and be completely confused for like 30 seconds, wondering which experience was real.
When Need for Speed Underground 2 came out on PS2, I stayed up for 3 days. Aside from being extremely tired and vision, hearing being very impaired, everything was mostly normal, until I woke up standing inside Subway probably 10 miles away with no memory of how I got there. I guess I was hungry.
Very calm as far as hallucinations go. I had driven for 20+ hours and was in the Arizona-California desert. It was the middle of the night, it had been dark for hours and only other car lights and stars were visible. Started seeing things out of the corner of my eyes, just kind of objects off a distance on the side of the road. Then it was things in the road ahead. That got my attention. After a bit I started seeing fantastic meteor-like showers in the sky. Wasn't scary or anything, didn't stop driving. To be young, dumb, and invincible again.
I drove across country from NY to California when I was 18. I was on a 2-lane highway in Kansas and got bad tunnel vision. But the thing about tunnel vision is you don't know it's happening when it's happening. The road was straight, flat, and there were no cars going by me, in front of me, or behind me. I ended up getting pulled over. When I saw the flashing lights behind me I pulled over immediately but wasn't sure how fast I was going or even if I was being pulled over for speeding. The first thing the officer asked me was why it took me so long to pull over. This was confusing since I pulled over right away. He told me he had been following me for almost 5 minutes with his lights and sirens on and that I had been going well over 100 miles per hour. He checked out my info, didn't give me a ticket. Told me to stay more alert, take frequent breaks, and to slow down.
It was the weirdest thing. I was taking notes on an extremely boring video in theology, but then words started appearing on their own without me writing anything. They were dancing around for a bit and I found it completely normal for a bit, but then I realized that words aren't supposed to dance. Then I snapped back to reality with nothing on my paper.
When I was in university, immediately after my father died, OD'd on Christmas Eve after I threw him out, I pretty much quit sleeping. Maybe 3 to 4 hours a night. Went through lots of counseling, lots of medication, 7 different sedatives and SSRIs, but basically just couldn't sleep. We had a home birth for my niece, so even when the grief wasn't overwhelming, the newborn baby kept me up. Anyways, I knew it got bad when I started microsleeping. I'd be in class listening to a lecture, blink and police officers would be standing beside me explaining what had transpired, then blink and I'd be back listening to class. Maybe mentally be out of it for 5 to 10 seconds but felt entirely lucid other than time dilation. The psychiatrist at the time said I was dropping into REM because I was so sleep deprived. Happens with new moms when babies are cluster feeding. I wasn't driving or anything, so not dangerous that way, but honestly lived in a fog for years. Just like snap of the finger, perfectly lucid horrible moment of my life, snap of the finger back. During this period I had a thing where I quit talking to people at school to see how long they would go without chatting to me. Literally had week stretches where not a word was said. Then came finals, started vomiting with anxiety when I tried to enter the exam rooms, which was an auto-fail for my classes. So academic probation, the opportunity to protest if I would speak in front of the university senate, which I clearly couldn't do, and eventual complete failure. There were times where I was hitting the student food bank after hours because I literally couldn't walk into a grocery store because my anxiety was so severe. So definitely can happen, but for me was pretty extreme situation.
It's a common occurrence for me. Nothing too out there, though, usually just visual aberrations, like constantly seeing shadows moving in my peripheral vision, mistaking random objects for completely different objects, etc., plus occasional auditory disturbances along with the typical sense of displacement. Once or twice I had instances where familiar people were complete strangers, no recognition whatsoever. That was pretty trippy and more than a little terrifying.
For context, this happened during some military training. Laying down in the woods desperately trying to stay awake, usually the plants turn into people. Like you'll see a figure walking around out in front of you, and then come to, and realize it was just a sapling or a bush or something. Happens surprisingly more during the day than the night.
I had a similar experience during military training. It was really dark out, and I hadn't slept for at least 48 hours. I saw and heard several people crawling towards me in the bushes, and I thought it was part of the exercise as we were on guard duty, just laying in the mud watching the woods. I called out to them several times, and my sergeant even had to go into the bushes to convince me there was no one there.
In basic, another guy and I got told to watch ammo one night before a range, and while we're sitting there I had an hour-long conversation with myself and didn't realize I'd been talking to myself until the other guy shook me and said, "Dude, you've been talking to yourself in your sleep for like an hour, you good?"
It's honestly scary. Like one time I was on the verge of falling asleep and I thought I felt somebody run their finger across my cheek. When I snapped upright into a sitting position, nobody was there. I live alone, by the way. I'm sure I hallucinated it, but that shit is scary regardless.
The same thing happened to me when I was a kid. I was just falling asleep and then I feel a hand on my head and I jerk up and search my whole room. I didn't sleep that night.
I used to have episodes of insomnia as a teenager. Once, while walking home from school, I saw a car driving in my direction. It suddenly veered onto the sidewalk, continued toward me, and swerved back onto the road moments before hitting me. I thought it was real, but I was so out of it from exhaustion that I didn't even flinch. I realized a few days later that the curb of the sidewalk was too high for a car to have possibly driven over.
I was in Costa Rica patrolling the beaches every night to find sea turtles laying their eggs. It was an eco-vacation thing, so during the day we would be up and exploring the area. I don't know how they expected people to function on like 3 hours of sleep for a week. But we did it. I mostly remember super irrational thoughts. Thinking animal noises were people talking. Thinking monkeys were dogs up in the trees. But the hallucinations were crazy. I'm not sure if the beach really was glowing some, or if I was making all of it up. But my mind was making crazy glowing patterns in the sand. I thought the glowing stuff was also biting me. Really, it was sand fleas. We would stop and take a break mid-patrol. I'd lay down to rest and think I was still walking. Then wake up and keep walking. I got really confused as to when I was awake. Never saw a fucking sea turtle.
Shadows creeping up the walls, but it's complete blackness and tendrils consuming everything. Or skittering shadows in my peripheral that look like people, animals, or bugs moving. Whispering, talking, or worse, singing. Sometimes I'll hear what sounds like music playing, and when I try to figure out where it comes from, it disappears. So, I go back to whatever I was doing, and then I'll start hearing children singing or people talking, footsteps, or a door closing. I get this from insomnia, before I have a seizure, or if I get too overwhelmed or overtaxed.